It could happen at any moment, without any warning. It could be tomorrow. It could be in the next hour. It could be now. Our entire world, the one we know so intimately, could come to an instantaneous halt. No more electric light, no more devices, no smartphones, no computers. The crucial question is not if, but when, and whether we could truly survive without the technology that defines us. The first few minutes would be the most disorienting. The world, usually shrouded in an undercurrent of electronic and artificial sound, would fall into a surreal silence. The hum of appliances, the flicker of displays, the constant noise of engines and machinery, all of it would vanish. Most of us are unaware of how deeply our senses are tuned to these signals. They have been the soundtrack to our entire lives, and in their sudden absence, we would find ourselves in a quiet so profound, it is almost frightening. In that quiet, the chaos begins. In hospitals, life support machines would fail. In the skies, aircraft would be unable to land safely. Trains would stop dead on their tracks, and subways would be stranded in their tunnels. Panic would emerge with force in the first few hours, as the realization spreads that this is not a simple neighborhood blackout, not a temporary power failure. Hundreds of thousands of motorists would find themselves trapped in gridlock, their vehicles rendered useless by inactive traffic lights and inoperable gas pumps. We could not even rely on the radio for news. Everything would be mute. The data connection on every debit, spoken word, to rumor, to a message written by hand. Within hours, the perception of chaos would begin to climb. People, deprived of clear information, would speculate on what is happening. Some might imagine a global cyber attack, others a solar flare, still others a complete collapse of the electric grids for reasons unknown. Without reliable news, the fear of what is not understood would dominate. And, as it so often does, fear generates unpredictable, even violent behavior. In the days that followed, supermarkets and stores would be stormed. Stockpiles of food, drinking water, and medicine would be exhausted with terrifying speed. Foods requiring refrigeration, meat, dairy, would spoil quickly in the heat and the absence of power. And so, people, seized by panic, would attempt to save what they could, to hoard anything that might last a little longer. Scenes of desperation, of long lines and outright looting would become the norm. The intricate web we built to insulate ourselves from the world is torn away, revealing not just our dependence, but the raw, unshielded core of what we are. In the sudden, silent dark, we are forced to confront the question of who we become when everything we have built is gone. Some would attempt to maintain order, but without central coordination, without communication, any semblance of control would slip through their fingers. In the hospitals, already tested by the first hours of the crisis, a new reality would dawn. The supply of medicine would dwindle, then vanish. Blood banks would be exhausted. Even the most basic procedures would become monumental challenges without powered equipment and reliable light. Lives that once hung by a thread would now be severed. Diseases long held in check by the simple miracle of refrigerated vaccines and ready access to medicine would reawaken. After a few days, the refuse would begin to accumulate. With collection services halted, the streets themselves would become vectors of sickness. The rhythm of public transportation would fall silent. Combustion engines would find no fuel, for the pumps that draw it from the earth require electricity to function. Even those with a private reserve would be trapped, the city arteries hopelessly clogged. Imagine millions of vehicles, frozen in place. Intersections transformed into monuments of twisted metal, their traffic signals dark and lifeless. The cities would become unrecognizable in a breathtakingly short time. Within a single week, the great urban areas would devolve into hotbeds of infection and violence. Without running water and purification plants, people would risk drinking from contaminated sources. Sickness would spread with terrifying speed, abetted by collapsing hygiene and the ghost of a healthcare system. Desperation, hunger, and thirst would ignite raids and clashes. A great exodus would begin, as millions, stripped of hope, attempt to flee the cities, pushing toward the countryside in search of shelter, cleaner air, and land that might offer sustenance. But here, they would face a new set of problems. In many rural zones, agriculture itself is a product of modern technology, dependent on electric irrigation systems, complex machinery, and synthesized fertilizers. Without power, all of it fails. A return to subsistence farming would demand time and traditional knowledge, skills now vanishingly rare. And not all would be willing to generously share their resources with the refugees pouring out from the cities. A bitter conflict would ignite between those who inhabit the rural lands and those who arrive from the outside. Over the course of a few weeks, our greatest weakness would be laid bare: our total dependence on electricity and the digital systems it powers. In the span of mere decades, we have transitioned from a simpler, more resilient way of life to an existence built upon a vast and intricate technological infrastructure. Everything is connected. Banks, hospitals, transportation, communication, even the water in our taps and the food on our tables. We have engineered a world of breathtaking complexity, a world of wonders, and in doing so, we have forgotten how to survive its absence. It would take only one catastrophic failure, a single cascading event, to plunge us back into a world that, for the purpose of daily survival, mirrors the distant past. But this would be an antiquity populated by a species far more numerous and profoundly unaccustomed to life without its machinery, its electronic extensions. Within 1 month, central governments would become ghosts. Deprived of every form of coordination, their authority would evaporate into silence. Telephone networks, internet connections, radio and television channels, the arteries of command, would be severed. Orders and directives would vanish into the static. Pockets of order might be attempted by local administrators, by the most organized sectors of police and military, but the sheer, suffocating scale of the crisis would render any large-scale control impossible. From this vacuum, new realities would emerge. Small, independent communities forged from necessity. They would organize to divide labor, to defend against attack, to share what little food and resources remained. The monetary economy would dissolve, and in its place, the ancient practice of barter would be resurrected. A liter of water, a sack of potatoes, a single hen, a supply of wood for the winter. These would become the new treasures, the currency that could purchase another day of life. Those who owned agricultural land would focus on the cultivation of staples, grains, tubers, and vegetables. Those living near a river or a lake would specialize in fishing. Slowly, painstakingly, ancient skills long forgotten in modernity would become precious once more. In the span of a few months, humanity would experience a drastic and brutal decline. Disease, conflict, and famine would claim millions. The great urban areas would be largely abandoned, inhabited only by groups willing to accept enormous risks for dwindling rewards. In the more isolated spaces, small villages and fortified farms would begin a life apart, attempting to recreate a fragile stability. People with traditional medical skills, those with agricultural or artisanal training, would become the most sought-after members of these new societies. Yet this would not make the time any easier. It would require an incredible effort of cooperation and a profound measure of luck for any new civilization to sprout and endure. After 1 year, the scenario would be unrecognizable. The grand infrastructures, power plants, railways, sewage systems would lie in a state of abandonment or ruin. Nature, in the meantime, would begin its patient reclamation. Roads and bridges, without maintenance, would collapse. The digital libraries, the online learning platforms, the vast medical and scientific databases, all would be inaccessible. Only the paper books, those that survived the chaos or were carefully preserved, would remain. They would be the last silent witnesses to what was lost, and the only seeds from which a future, any future, might one day be grown. A great chasm would open between the generations, one that knew the world of instant light and one born into the quiet dark. The accumulated knowledge of centuries would become a fractured inheritance, passed down in whispers and worn-out books. With desperate ingenuity, some would scavenge the ruins of the old world. They would hunt for generators, for solar panels, for the silent, skeletal remains of wind turbines, attempting to resurrect small islands of local power. But these efforts would be a battle against entropy. Every machine is a promise of future failure. Maintenance would demand spare parts that no longer existed, crafted with tools that had themselves fallen silent. Still, even the most meager current would grant a strategic advantage. It could mean the difference between sickness and health, purifying water 1 precious liter at a time. It could power a single bulb, pushing back the primal fear of the night. It could sustain a basic medical device, a fragile lifeline in a world of renewed dangers. From this crucible, human creativity would again emerge, a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. Communities would weave new networks of exchange, powered by muscle and wind. Horses, bicycles, and sailboats would become the engines of a new commerce, stitching together the scattered settlements across vast distances. Those blessed with fertile land would turn to intensive, purely organic agriculture, rediscovering a partnership with the soil, free from the chemical ghosts of the industrial age. There would be attempts to rebuild education, with the few surviving teachers gathering the young, their only tools the printed word and the fragile vessel of collective memory. In the face of overwhelming crisis, the human soul would seek consolation. A return to deeper, more archaic forms of spirituality would take hold, as it so often does when the structures of civilization crumble. For some, the Great Blackout was not an accident, but a judgment, a divine punishment, or a signal from a higher power. Radical new convictions would be born in the darkness. Others, more pragmatic, would rally around the cold, hard facts of science, clinging to what little technology could be preserved and understood. Ideological tensions would inevitably arise. New faiths, new sects, new philosophies would vie for the hearts and minds of the survivors. History teaches us that such fractures are not the exception, but the rule in times of profound instability. And amid these grand, sweeping changes, there are the ordinary people. Families, elders, and children, all locked in the quiet, daily struggle for survival, for a sliver of normality. They would gather around crackling fires as the sun fell, telling stories of a Pa could conjure light from a glass orb, when clean water flowed endlessly from a metal spout. For them, a single crucial question would hang in the smoke-filled air. Could they ever go back? Was it possible to rebuild the world they had lost? Perhaps. But it would demand a collaboration of unprecedented scale, a painstaking recovery of lost skills and scattered materials. It would require not just the rebuilding of machines, but the rebuilding of trust. It is in the quiet spaces between us, after all, that worlds are not only lost, but sometimes, against all odds, found again. The timeline for what comes next is not measured in years, but in generations. A question would hang in the silent air. Should humanity strive to restore every aspect of the past? Or is this the chance to forge something new? A society more attuned to the natural world, less vulnerable to human error or the whims of fate. Perhaps after countless trials, some might restart small workshops, sparking to life the most basic production chains, the simplest mechanical and artisanal tools. But it is difficult to imagine rebuilding entire industrial complexes from the dust. Microchip foundries, satellite networks, nuclear power plants, all of it would be the stuff of myth, especially without the detailed manuals and the specialized knowledge lost in the initial chaos. The truth is, as tragic and destructive as it might be, a global blackout would serve as the ultimate reminder of our extraordinary and at the same time fragile dependence on technology. Until the day before the collapse, most of us would live unaware of the invisible threads connecting the entire planet. But in the harsh reality that followed, the proof would be undeniable. Every facet of modern life, from health to security, from sustenance to communication, has become profoundly and irreversibly tethered to the flow of electricity. At the same time, this very scenario would remind us of our capacity for adaptation. We would be forced to reinvent ourselves, to learn ancient skills, to rediscover forms of solidarity and social organization. A destiny at once frightening and, from the perspective of human ingenuity, strangely galvanizing. Now imagine finding yourself in this world. What would remain of all that you possess? Would you know how to survive without running water, without light, without transportation? Would you undertake a journey toward more hospitable lands? Or would you attempt to fortify your own territory? Do you have useful skills? Something to offer a community in exchange for protection and resources? These are questions that perhaps few of us ask ourselves in earnest, but they are worth reflecting upon. Without descending into paranoia, we might at least consider the possibility that not everything we take for granted will remain forever within reach. Countless historical events, from great wars to natural catastrophes, teach us that normalcy can vanish in an instant. We live in a world of staggering complexity. And the greater the complexity, the more catastrophic the potential collapse, should the cornerstones of this system ever break. To prepare in advance does not mean believing one can live disconnected from modernity. It means, perhaps, possessing a greater awareness of how technology has both liberated us and, in the very same stroke, made us vulnerable. If the great blackout were to arrive tomorrow, would we be ready? The answer is almost certainly no. But in that silence, we would be forced to ask a more fundamental question. Stripped of our technological scaffolding, what are the true limits of humanity? What is our untapped potential? How would we react as a species when faced with a challenge so absolute? We must consider this, for in the answer we may discover that our entire vision of the future hangs not on the systems we have built, but on the resilience we have forgotten.